Closing out this lecture series is always a bit of a challenge. I thought what we'd do today, though, is talk a little bit about things which will seem absolutely logical given what you've seen already in the course, which is where we're headed and why, if things are attended to in the way they currently are. I'm going to close out, in addition, answering a question: what do we think about these things, and why are the various dominant ways in which we think about nuclear weapons and their spread and their use, why do they fall short? I think each of these schools, and I'll talk about each of them, has something to offer. They participate each in some profound truth, but they also are inattentive to their flaws, and we shouldn't be. And then I'll open it up for final peanut gallery comments from you. Okay. You all have at least seen the book cover of Underestimated. Some of you have read it. How many have actually bothered to read it? Okay. Well, I'm told it's 2 hours of your life. It has pictures. It's geared ideally for people who are 12 years old because it's only 30,000 words. Try it. Let me know what you think. But it was not meant to be a difficult book. In any case, I wrote that book because I couldn't find any studies that identified sort of big picture, long-term nuclear trends that could be used to forecast what we might be in for. I mean, and normally when you come to the field of nuclear policy, whether it's military or whether it's non-proliferation, which is horizontal, or vertical, you get a discussion of trends roughly measured in 12 to 48 months. So you learn that Iran, North Korea, India, Syria, Pakistan, what's happening? What should we do next? And I went yesterday and was asked to speak before a bunch of senior level NATO officials, and they were all about, well, what's going on with INF? What's next? What do we do? And I think when I got up, I said, well, why don't we think about the next 10 to 20 years? After all, almost everyone we hate might be dead by then. Let's think in that time frame. I couldn't find anything, as I said, in the literature that was willing to do that. Now, it seems like every dignified field, economics, foreign affairs, military, and political science, for all of their deficiencies, they all do that. And so it could be that nuclear policy isn't a dignified or serious field, because it doesn't. So I thought, okay, why don't I be first? I always like being first because no matter how poorly you do, you're best. I like shooting at objectives I know I can meet. The approach I took, I think, is simple, and it consisted of, well, how bad could things get? I wanted to spell that out. And I tried to avoid the kookiest stuff, masked men in Peoria blowing up, stadiums and things like that. But I didn't exactly pull punches. And my thinking wasn't so much to make a projection as to make reasonable warnings, which, if heeded, might assure that the scenarios that I was presenting would never happen. I think a lot of people get this wrong when they read and comment with self-satisfaction about Jack Kennedy. I think I've mentioned this already. if you want to go on the free food circuit and you want to go listen to people talk about, let's say, nuclear proliferation, invariably you'll have to listen to someone explain that, well, Jack Kennedy said, in March of '63, by 1970s, there'd be 15 to 20 countries that have nuclear weapons, and it didn't happen. It's as if, when they say this, that they are elevating themselves to the level of Jack Kennedy. He made a mistake, we didn't. I'm not as stupid as I look, and he might have been stupider than he looked, and it was a mistake. I've corrected it. I think this gets things fundamentally wrong. I mean, I'm no big fan of Jack Kennedy, but in all fairness to him, he was trying to warn folks what would happen unless the U.S. and other states acted to stem nuclear proliferation. And, you could argue within limits his warnings were heeded. I mean, there was in '64, after his death, passage of the Limited Test Ban Treaty. And shortly thereafter, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was formalized. So, maybe the worst of his fears weren't realized, but it wasn't because people weren't listening. It's because they were. Okay, so I said, all right, so with this in mind, I'm going to paint as bad a picture as I can. And I decided to focus on roughly a half century because we're a metric kind of culture. We like things in tens. And half century, okay, I can deal with it. Also, that at the time I started writing, that was roughly the Cuban Missile Crisis, so it was terrific, Now, as you may note, the handful of you who looked at the book, I talk about four trends: nuclear weapons deployments, production and stockpile of nuclear explosive materials, spread of nuclear reactor and fissile material production, spread of nuclear weapons capable missile delivery systems. Also, maybe five. The evolution of nuclear weapons use policies was at least referred to. Now, there are other trends. I may even bring them up because I wrote that book originally, I think it was in 2013. It's 5 years. I have put out the second edition, which tries to update things. And I will continue to try to do that every roughly 18 months. Now, I'm not going to go through all the particulars because, well, it's in the book. But I'd like to discuss two trends that we've talked about during the class to suggest why things actually are not as bad as they look. They're worse. Okay. The first trend I want to talk about is nuclear compaction and what arms control experts in the 1960s referred to as Damoclesian overhang. Now, does anybody know the myth of Damocles? Oh, come on. Didn't we have to take mythology in like grade school at least? You're shaking your head. No.
The sword hanging over the head.
Yes. I'm so pleased when I hear our culture, what little we have is not entirely dead. Okay, tell the story.
Oh, that's the best thing to story I'm familiar with.
Well, we're almost dead. Well, it turns out there was a king, Dionysus, and Dionysus II, if you really want to know. And in his court, there was a man named Damocles, and Damocles wanted to be king for a day. And Dionysus more or less said, okay, but you can only sit in the throne if you sit underneath a sword hanging by a thread over your head. And the point of this was to convey to him that being king was not pleasant, and terrible things could happen to kings. Things were contingent. This was used as an analogy by the folks in Cambridge, where I always like to point out all respected opinion comes, yes. And they said, well, as more and more countries get nuclear weapons, and as more and more of the countries that have them get more and more, the risk of the end of the days increases. Yeah? And our fate hangs by the thread of a hair. Yeah? All right, so let's take a look at this idea of compaction. Now, it's my use. It has no validity in any social scientific place. So if you start talking about, well, yes, the problem of compaction, people will look at you like you're out of your mind. They don't know what you're talking about. But I use the term just to make it easy. What do we got here? That's not compaction. So let's go to the additional charts. Okay, if you looked in 62, this is the world on nuclear weapons. 24,000 in the U.S., 50 in the U.K. France, I always like to point out, every time it exploded a device, its arsenal went down to, maybe zero. It didn't have much. And then Russia, 2,500. Yeah. Here's a schematic. If you wanted to see how the world looked with a graphic, it would be something like this. The number of complicating relationships between were not overwhelmingly large, but there they were. All right, current state of play, you've got, I want to say, 9, don't we? U.S. is 1, U.K. is 2, France is 3, Israel is 4, 5, 6 is India, Pakistan, 7 is China, 8 is Russia, and then North Korea. There you go, 9. All right. Now, I think what we do, this is a chart that was shown to me, it was argued, I graphically represented it, that this, I'm doing that, all right. Stop it. Okay, thank you. Well, it's a little more complicated, but really the way to look at this is, since we're the only country that can go in and crush a small country or occupy it for 15, 20 years, we're the biggest ball anyway. And that the way to look at these complications is we're the sun god. Everything revolves around the United States. I kind of like this story because I have an American passport, so this works for me. And then just to add a certain patina of confidence, we have the UK and France roughly as part of NATO, and so they're kind of like Europeans, or kind of like a unified state or something, and which is not quite true, but they're NATO allies, and then we have we have non-NATO allies, literally in law. I don't know if you know this. There's a designation called non-NATO ally. And that would be, what do we have here? We have Pakistan. I'm not sure that status is any longer good. Which tells you the ball's changed. Israel. Then we had India as a strategic partner, which I find rather interesting. When you talk to an Indian, they have a kind of different view about that. China, which I guess no longer is a stakeholder, they're just, I don't know, what do we call them now? A peer competitor? I think we say competitor. Not quite an enemy, but a competitor. Russia, I guess, used to be a strategic partner, but now I guess it's a competitor. Yeah. So, the designations change, but the idea is, us, radial. The other connections, not so much. Now, I think all of that has suffered tremendously in the last 9 years. There's another chart to be made here probably, but this is the way in which we looked at these things until recently. And so it's sort of manageable. Another way to look at this, though, is this way. And essentially in 1962, we had 25,000, the Russians had 24,000, the British had 50. And what's fun is if you take the smallest number, which is about 50, and you compare it to the largest number, which is 25,000, you get 3 orders of magnitude differential. In other words, the largest is about 1,000 times greater than the smallest arsenal. So that's a pretty decent spread. Now over here we have our 9 countries. Ooh, excuse me. And what's interesting is if you throw even North Korea in, I used to say North Korea was like France. Now, let's say they have 60 going on 100. Well, in which case, let's kind of round upwards, be a little creative, say 100. Maybe that they have 20, but they're on their way, okay? I mean, maybe that's the way to look at it. I suspect it's closer to 50 now. They didn't call and give me the number, so I'm not sure. But if it's about 100, what's interesting is the largest arsenal is the Freudian slip, the Russian arsenal. And, that's somewhere in the thousands, maybe 2,000 to 4,000. Well, but that isn't 3 orders of magnitude difference from the smallest to the largest. That's, 1 order of magnitude. So you've gone from a differential of 3 orders of magnitude to 1 order of magnitude. Do I need to ask? Maybe I should. Does anybody know what an order of magnitude is? I'm going to put the laser on you. Order of magnitude. There we go. You see, you're lucky who you're sitting next to.
It's multiples of 10.
Multiples of 10. Now, if you want to impress people in small talk, throw out, well, that's an order of magnitude greater. And whoa, look at it. Where'd she come from? She's from MIT or something. So now you benefited from the course. Order of magnitude. 2 orders is 2 zeros. 3 is, 3 zeros. So 1,000 is 3 orders of magnitude. I want you all to employ this once in small talk in the next week. Okay. All right. So you can say, okay, we have that rather dramatic number, but what difference does it make if we look at the world this way? And the answer is, if you look at the world this way, not so much. However, I think that doesn't quite capture what you should be looking at. This compaction is interesting because it's much more of a crowd that you're running in compared to this. And the crowd has sharper elbows and they're coming in contact with one another. There's a way to look at it. They're closer to one another. Now, if it stays this way, no problema. But there's reason to believe that, we'll go past this for a moment. I suppose this gets to it. The ability to move from atoms for peace to atoms for war, as you've learned from this course, could be a lot quicker than it used to be. Half century ago, the number of countries that had nuclear civil programs, was maybe 3. Now, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 10, an order of magnitude more, right? 10 times more. All right. Why does that matter? Well, because those programs are bomb starter kits. Now, if you add to that this chart, let's see, where do we go here? Oh, I have to go back. We'll find it. Lots going on here. This chart, which you've seen before. In 1962, I think I pointed out in an earlier lecture, how much spare fissile material was there hanging around that wasn't already going in a naval reactor or bomb. Real simple number. About this. Every gram found its way into a military program. This is the world on nuclear materials today, though. these numbers show that there are tens of thousands of bombs worth of material hanging around in various forms, including non-deployed weapons or weapons cores, that could be disposed of eventually or turned back into weapons. Now, in the case of the Russians and the U.S., the numbers are in the tens of thousands. In the case of Great Britain, it's, and France, it's thousands. And I would throw in possibly in that category, maybe India, if you include the civil plutonium that they have. Certainly Japan has something like 2,500 bombs worth of stockpiled plutonium on their soil, never mind, overseas. Then you go into Israel. Who else is up there? Well, China has several hundred at least, maybe 1,000. Who else do we have? Israel. Who's that? Hang on. Oh, Pakistan. Its stockpile is growing. So the point here is now countries that have nuclear weapons could go to a stash to have lots more because they have stuff in reserve. And even countries that don't have nuclear weapons, like Japan, might be able to go. And you'd say, well, it'd still take a few years, and it might. But to get those stockpiles took decades. So the closure time to get not just a bomb, but a batch of bombs, shorter. Now, if it was just that, well, it'd be bad enough, wouldn't it? But now, in addition, you have these civil programs like Rakasho. Perhaps in the near future, we'll agree to let South Korea have pyro reprocessing. This is now, we're just talking about plutonium now. India has a big plutonium program. Maybe in the future, Saudi Arabia. Who knows? We'll see how that box goes. But the point is that these plants, this one in particular, is already built. It's supposed to start up in 2021. That's roughly 36 months. This is the amount of plutonium that Japan has. It does not have more than 9 reactors right now operating, of which only 1 or 2, maybe 3, are really good burners of plutonium mixed oxide fuel. And so once that thing opens, up goes the stockpile again. The Chinese want to get a plant pretty much like this and gone to the French and negotiated, and they want to operate their plant presumably roughly around 2021 or 2 or 3, and then operate it for 10 years and stockpile for a fast reactor. Well, 10 years times, what does this produce? Oh, it produces 8,000 kilograms of plutonium. Did I get that right? That doesn't sound right. 8 tons. 8 tons. What's 8,000 divided by 5? Quick.
400.
8,000 divided by 5. 400. No, I've got something wrong here. 8,000 divided by 5?
1,600.
Okay. 8 tons. 8 tons is 8,000 kilograms. Oh, 8,000.
2,000.
What's that?
2,000 pounds.
1,000 kilograms.
1,000 kilograms. It's a little over 2,000 pounds.
Okay, so it takes about 5 kilograms. Boy, never did a lecture fall apart so quickly. Does anyone have a hand calculator?
Well, I think everyone on the phone does.
Yes. Well, could someone please plug in? If it produces 8,000 kilograms a year, divide by 5.
1,600.
1,600. Thank you. Someone said 600, I thought.
No.
No, 1,600. Well, how many weapons do we have in our arsenal, our strategic arsenal, deployed? 1,500, something like that? Well, that's what that's going to produce a year. Okay, let's go to China now. They want to make a plant with basically the same capacity figures. So what's 10 times, I don't know, 1,600? Oh, it's 16,000. Oh, wait a minute. It's for peaceful purposes. That's good to know because that's the amount of weapons material Russia and the United States has. And the Chinese do not currently have that, at least not plutonium. When we take a look at highly enriched uranium, there is, in Japan, it's funny. What is that doing there? It's interesting. We probably want to change this slide for in the future. I don't know why I combined the enrichment plant there. But in any case, there is an enrichment plant. That enrichment plant belongs on this slide. In other words, this belongs here. When it comes to highly enriched uranium, or the capacity to make it, here is a chart showing how much capacity China will have in about 24 months. It's a big jump. And by any measure, there's going to be 4.5 million SWUs surplus of any civilian demand. Well, that's about 1,500 bombs worth a year. And, of course, the Japanese have a smaller version. That's this plant here. And it, might produce, I believe, what we have here. If they decide not to use any of it for civil purpose, about 500 bombs worth a year. Then you have North Korea. Okay, my point is that these civil programs are making the uncertainties and the amounts of uncertainties larger when compounded with the stockpiles that are hanging around. And I think if you put all of those things together with this chart about compaction, you get to a slightly more paranoid conclusion, and that is, could it be that we're moving towards a world where countries that have nuclear weapons can ramp up to get much larger numbers. Countries that don't could get not a bomb, but a batch of bombs pretty quickly, relatively quickly, in a way never before recorded in history. I think the short answer is yes. So you want to be careful now. You don't want to excite anybody's humors, I guess is the way to look at it. Now, I looked at this and I came up with this chart. This is at the height of zero enthusiasm, which is to say, we were all going to go down to zero. I did this chart in 2008, I think, a decade ago. And I said, well, whoops. I suppose we're all going to go down to here, and that's 1,000. We haven't quite made it. Somewhat close. That would be the next step. But that, others might have somewhere between, 100 and 200, or maybe somewhere like that. Big uncertainty would be China. There were predictions, or I should say, estimates by Russians at least, that the numbers were to be measured close to 1,000 or more. But that as we came down, the distance between these two things would be very small. And then, given the compaction issues that I've raised, the ability to change who's the top dog could be rather high. Okay, that's called instability. How's that? That's another Cambridge expression. All right, so I thought I was really hot stuff with this observation. Nice little chart. So I started to share all this, and I even was asked to testify before the Commission on Strategic Posture. Now, before you get impressed by that, I think half of Washington was briefing them, so, it just meant I had a zip code somewhere, in the local area. But, I just showed this to them, and they even published it, along with 20 other briefs, and didn't know anything, you'd be impressed by that. But I think what impressed me more was, there wasn't much resonance. Now, I took heart when one of the ideas that I had, I talked about a possible sprint to equality, and I noticed that former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld started talking about a sprint to parity, and I thought, sprint to equality, sprint to parity. Maybe he read what I wrote, because I had published it. Of course, everybody likes to think they're being read, and it's not true. I mean, how many people read the book? Yeah, well, so there you go. Now, I thought, well, maybe he read it, and the reason why is he used to be on a board that approved all my grants. And I had written this in one of the proposals, and he might have read the proposal, I thought. A year later, I found myself attending a presentation. I'd never met the man, and I thought, well, he's going to talk. Maybe I should go see what the Secretary of Defense looks like. So I went in a room, and there were about 200 people, and I asked a question. I stood up. I said, my name's Henry Sikorski, and he immediately stopped the forward progression of my comments by saying, I know who you are. I've read everything you've ever written. At which point he said, what's your question? I said, I withdraw my interest in even raising a question. I'm going to sit down while I'm ahead. In any case, who knows? All I know is that for the most part, nobody paid any attention to this. I mean, it had no resonance. And I do, what any solid academic would do when confronted by inattention, particularly when they're writing a book, which this is part of a book. You just put the chapter aside and you stop writing. And you say, well, I'll come back to this. And I did for quite a while until I got a phone call from my alma mater, which is University of Chicago, which I thought was pretty amazing. As I want to point out, you're looking at somebody who didn't get done. I have all the dissertation, you see. They're calling me and they want me to speak? Wow, talk about closure. Yeah, I got to do this, right? But then they said, well, you have to write about something that you're writing for a book. I said, well, I'm having a little difficulty with my book. And then I thought about it. I said, well, wait a minute. I'll take you up on it. And I thought, well, why don't I use this as an occasion to try to figure out why the people that have opinions don't think my opinion is worth repeating. Maybe I should review the literature and try to find out, why what I think isn't what other people think. Yeah? Now, some of these, things that I had read before, but it had been a while. And what I made in the way of a discovery was something basic but odd. It really didn't matter which school of thought about nuclear weapons policy you focused on. The zero crowd that wanted you to eliminate nuclear weapons and was opposed to the spread of nuclear weapons. Hawkish supporters of nuclear weapons who wanted to enhance or maintain our stockpile and our capabilities, and who opposed, adversaries getting nuclear weapons, but were kind of quiet or even mildly supportive of close allies maybe getting an option. And then the other last school, I call them academic skeptics, who either think that nuclear proliferation is stabilizing because the mere acquisition of one or two automatically deters all forms of aggression, or that it's inconsequential because, well, nuclear weapons are militarily irrelevant. No matter which of these three schools you went to, each insisted that the very best future that was possible was the one you would get if you followed their advice. Really? You'd think there'd be a little modesty about these propositions. I mean, how many data points again do we have of use? 2. Kind of hard to do regression analysis on 2 data points, isn't it? You'd think we'd be a little humble. The confidence in these matters impressed me as very weird. That said, I think if you look at each one of these schools, you get something that's sound. They have something sound. And you also see some clear failings. And I think if you want to get an impression of what is a sound opinion, which I don't think it's any of these three, by the way, it's useful to go through them. So why don't we do that? That's what I'm going to do, and then we'll open it up for conversation. The first school is what I refer to as the zero crowd. And it calls for, well, you guessed it, the elimination of nuclear weapons. And it opposes the spread of these weapons to other countries. Now, up until this administration, and I would argue even this administration, in all fairness, this is roughly the view of the U.S. government and most of its allies. I mean, even Trump talks about how it would be desirable to get rid of nuclear weapons. I went to a gathering yesterday, as I mentioned, in front of NATO folk, and there was someone extremely senior in the Pentagon who gave a talk, and he used the N-word repeatedly. Non-proliferation, NPT, non-proliferation, NPT. Well, you know, you'd almost think we were listening to someone in the Obama administration. I thought it was interesting. So, yeah, it still kind of colors official policy in a lot of places, the zero crowd. Now, what this school, I think, gets profoundly right is the political power and appeal of the number 0 nuclear weapons. You know, okay, nuclear disarmament may not happen, but you can imagine if you put all of the nuclear-armed countries' leaders in this room and you locked the door and said, no one's getting out until you agree on a number, probably the only number they could agree on would be that everyone should get rid of all of them, right? Well, you know, you can snicker, and God knows I've done critiques of this line of thinking. That's pretty powerful stuff, rhetorically, at the very least. You know, never mind whether they would actually agree to disarm or even agree on how to get to 0. To get out of the room, they'd use that number. So it's not for nothing that presidents and a lot of other leaders give lip service to this number. I think the reason why actually has something substantive to it, though. I mean, it's not just, you know, some kind of fake news point. I think it's because we kind of know how we got into this. We were worried about the Nazis getting the bomb, and the Russians were afraid of the U.S. having a monopoly. And, you know, it goes on, different reasons. What we don't know is how the story will end. I guess we're banking on things just going hunky-dory, you know. But last I checked, we did have 2 data points, and if you lived in those cities, it was not good. It was pretty awful. Now, I think the critics of the zero crowd underestimate this point, and they do so at their own peril, because frankly, it's got legs. It's not going away as a powerful point. And I think people who say, oh, well, we've turned the corner, nobody talks about 0. Well, they have treaties to eliminate nuclear weapons. Elections change. People's rhetoric will change. It'll go back and forth. Watch this box. So let's go a little bit deeper into the zero crowd. You know, I think they do a pretty good job of explaining the advantages of a world without nuclear arms. And that would be, well, if you're an American, you can beat the crap out of all sorts of people who don't have nuclear weapons. Or you could argue that wars are more difficult. They're less devastating. There's less likelihood of a small country catalyzing a major war. I mean, you go through it all. I think they do an okay job on how you might keep the world at 0 if you ever got there. And they have, you know, studies on this. I think what they don't do so well, though, is detailing how you transition from a low number, say a few hundred, to 0. and what the security risks are in making this transition. I think what they don't want to talk about is how could you be sure that someone else might not ramp up as you ramp down? I think all of that gets insufficient attention. Now, you can argue about this in a kind of academic way and say, well, you know, it's not very probable, or it, you know, would be more visible than you think, and on. But if you're a politician or a military leader, you're just going to be very wary about being caught out, and I think it's not going to be persuasive, and so that's a real problem. Now, I think the bigger problem by far, though, is how these folks think about nuclear deterrence. Now, some of the zero-crowd people will tell you that, well, nuclear weapons actually have not, do not, and cannot deter aggression. I give them a C for consistency. I mean, whether you agree or disagree, at least that's a position, that makes some sense on the level of consistency. I think most supporters of zero, though, don't go that route. They go instead that nuclear weapons are only useful for deterring other countries from ever using their nuclear arms. I think this is an effort to show two things: that you can come down further because you don't need many. If you're going to murder a lot of people in cities, how many of these things do you need? You surely don't need thousands. That would be the argument. They also, I think, wittingly or not, they're trying to show how militarily silly it is to invest heavily in this. But as I challenged someone who made this argument, I said, so let me get it straight. You think it's important to demonstrate, and you think you can somehow scientifically, that they're only useful for deterring other countries from using their weapons. I would have thought that that would be a compelling argument for everyone to get them. Let's just say that project of his stopped with that phone conversation. This brings us then to the hawkish supporters of nuclear weapons, whose key argument is that nuclear weapons deter aggression and keep the peace. They argue that if you fail to maintain or enhance nuclear weapons forces, the allies we protect, Japan, Turkey, South Korea, I guess now Saudi Arabia is a key ally, so we'll put them in, would be sorely tempted to get weapons of their own. Yeah? And that would be bad. So let's review the bidding on this argument. I think there's something to recommend, actually much to recommend this argument. It's difficult to prove that nuclear weapons deterred in every case that they've claimed historically. That may be true. But it's also very difficult to argue, because the list is so long, that none of them on this list actually happened or, were relevant. One of them probably was true. And if only one of them was true, like, well, the Berlin crisis was, didn't lead to war because we threatened to use nuclear weapons. Well, as our president would say, that's huge. You got to give them credit, right? Good luck proving one way or the other. So I think it's hard to believe that none of these cases is so. Also, in recent news stories, you can see that our allies worry about whether we're going to maintain our promise to use nuclear weapons if things go badly. So, South Korea is debating whether to acquire nuclear weapons. At least they used to be before President Moon. And that wasn't that long ago. It was about a year ago. And they're saying, well, maybe we have to because the U.S. won't be there for us. It seems to me that suggests that the argument about these things deterring is something that has to be seriously thought about. You may not get satisfactory answers, but the idea that you blow off the question strikes me as kind of nutty. Also, I guess I want to make sure I get this point, if it is a point here. Yeah, I think I've made the points about deterrence. Now, those are all the reasons why, there's a lot to be said for the hawkish supporter school of nuclear weapons. I think, though, that there is a problem with this school, and that is how unbounded their arguments are. So if nuclear weapons deterred during the Cold War when we had many, many more of them, wouldn't more nuclear weapons today deter more as well? Certainly we're warned that having relatively less or too few would be a worry. In other words, the JCS says, wouldn't be prudent to go below where we are in deployments. Well, the flip side of that argument is, well, maybe you want more then. I don't know. I haven't heard the JCS or others argue why more wouldn't be better. And luckily, they've never been pressed on this, because if they were, I bet you there'd be somebody raising hands and go, yes! And then you'd be off and running. And the question is, how many? How many? And that gets Talmudic quickly, is my guess. And they have to, the way you protect yourself on that answer is you make it code word, because you don't really want to have to explain that one in public for a variety of good and bad reasons, right? So then there's the matter of quality. If more nuclear weapons deter more, wouldn't better nuclear weapons deter better, right? Now, isn't that what's behind the modernization? I'm of the view that if you have a 62 Falcon and you haven't, redone the suspension and you've got that inline six, it's time to buy another car. So, I don't have a problem with that. But there's, the question is, do I get a Ferrari? Probably not. So what do I buy? Big debate. Anyway. Finally, if nuclear weapons help us deter aggression, shouldn't our closest allies have them as well? The UK, France, maybe Israel, maybe Saudi Arabia if Iran gets them, maybe Japan or Korea. You're off and running. Certainly, Russia or China might look at their friends. Of course, I don't know how many friends they got, but, maybe Belarus needs nuclear weapons. I'm making that up. I don't really have a good argument here. But the point is do they then extend to their quote-unquote friends? Now, if more deters more, better deters better, and more nuclear weapons in more friendly hands deters more still, you've got quite an argument going here. At this point, I would be grabbing for your wallet. Maybe you don't want to be all in on this. How much is enough is part of the problem with the argumentation of this school. Now, one last difficulty with this school is that it consciously or not downplays the risk of nuclear accidents, illicit use, seizure, nuclear terrorism. The argument roughly is so far so good. Haven't been stolen, haven't been used, seems unlikely, and I'm willing to agree. But that it'll never happen seems like a bet against the house. And I think people kind of in their bones sense that. After all, not only are American pilots trained to go to launch points, but Chinese, Russian, Israeli, Indian, Pakistani pilots are trained. And at some point, one of them might say, today is the day. Let's go ahead. I remember being told of a general who, in the Cold War, had to climb into his B-52 wing plane and tell the squadron they were going to the launch point. It was Cuban Missile Crisis. And he pretty much assumed that that was going to be the last day of his life. And when he was called back, he described it as the single most disappointing moment in his professional career. And he was not a nut. He listened to Beethoven. He went to Harvard. He was a decent guy. Okay? So we don't know how this works. Also, as I mentioned before, deterrence occurs between this ear and this ear. And what goes on in here is truly mysterious. We do not understand ourselves. We sure as hell don't understand anybody else. We can do better or worse at this, but there's a lot of room for improvement, last I checked. It's almost enough to make someone religious to work that problem. All right, so, okay. It should be noted, however, that whatever error there might be in this group with regard to downplaying the terrorism and the accidental stuff, it's, I would argue, exceeded by the almost hysterical description of the probability of these events by the zero crowd. And what I mean is they say it's the most immediate and extreme threat we face. Really? As I went through in the terrorism class, I don't buy it. Now, maybe somebody else does, but I mean, you can't project probabilities for events that we have no statistics on, and to start saying that assumes you really have that knowledge, and we don't. Don't have specific intelligence. Isn't that easy to make a bomb, you know? But in any case, I think a bigger point is, as a friend of mine at the Arms Control Association pointed out, he said, you know, to say it's the most extreme threat ignores the possibility of a nation having an exchange with one another, wiping out a large number of cities or God knows what else. That would be more extreme, he said. I'm with him. This brings us to the last school, the radical academics, who have challenged almost all the prevailing views on things nuclear, including nuclear terrorism as well as nuclear deterrence and proliferation. You can tell I'm drawn like a moth to a light to this crew. I mean, it's what do they have to say, you know? I kind of compare these people to the sophists of old. Does anybody know who the sophists were? Sophist. Well, have you ever heard someone say, well, that's sophistic? No? Okay, the other reason you took this course, to understand sophism. Sophism is when you make a strong argument weak and a weak argument strong. It's being a pain in the ass and contrarian for the love and the sport of it all. So these guys are kind of like sophists. And because much of conventional wisdom is, well, let's just describe it for what it is, conventional, contradicting it gets you to some places that actually make more sense. You know? So it's not like they're totally wrong. So they argue that nuclear weapons may not be very useful. They challenge their use for deterring aggression. They challenge how likely nuclear terrorism is. They challenge our tough policies right now towards North Korea and Iran's nuclear program and dealing with other problem states. I think all of these arguments are worth going through, and the reason why is they challenge your thinking. And with something this important, we should be challenged. So I recommend it. That said, on certain points, they're either silent or kind of go over the top. You know, they go too far. For example, the neo-realists among them celebrate what they believe is the automaticity of nuclear deterrence. These people say, like Waltz, that Iran should get the bomb, you know, because it'll deter, keep the peace. They pay almost no attention, however, to the risks associated from going from 0 nuclear weapons to 1, or from 1 to a larger force. I mean, it's as if Waltz made this recommendation, ignoring all of the attacks by Israel, the United States, the UK, Iran, and Iraq on nuclear facilities in the Middle East. They're quite a large number. I already showed that lecture to you. Never mind. Really? I think you need to pay attention. Those are acts of war and could lead to war writ large. And it's non-trivial. So that's one problem they have. I think the other problem is, you know, they also can't remember all the planned attacks there were that didn't go forward. I mean, India was going to let the Israelis attack the Pakistanis up until, you know, a few moments before they decided otherwise. So, I mean, we were going to possibly do certain attacks on North Korea, it's claimed. I'm skeptical, but there were people who talked that way. The Russians wanted to do certain things. They asked for permission from us. I mean, there's a lot going on here. Finally, I think the radical academics downplay the deterrence value of nuclear weapons, and they go too far when they argue that these weapons have not, in fact, been a major force in history. They have. They go too far when they say the further spread of nuclear weapons is of little or no consequence in international peace. Try to explain that to Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, South Korea, Japan right now. Doesn't sound right. that non-proliferation causes war. This is one of my favorite. They point to Iraq and Iran. And this assumes the non-proliferation is actually, or was actually, the cause of these wars against Iraq. And that the U.S. Is eager to militarily attack Iran, which I don't think it is. And that the nuclear non-proliferation rules really have teeth, which I don't think they do. But they assume all of this. Then they argue that preventing proliferation, this is my favorite, deprives us of massive economic benefits we'd otherwise enjoy with less restricted nuclear power. I don't have to get into that. Maybe, but, it's an expensive way to boil water. It also assumes that non-proliferation rules are the reason why nuclear power isn't prospering, which I don't think is correct. So for any practitioner, these academics are like academic, okay? All right. So it's tempting to choose one of these schools or to combine them to get some optimal mix. I don't recommend this. I don't think, I think it's good to review them, know the strengths and weaknesses, but I don't think you get to where you want to go by mixing and matching. So they always ask in Washington, where are you? Where are you now? You ever hear that? Ever been to a coffee clutch and someone doesn't know you, says, well, where are you? And then if they're really arrogant, they act as though they know you and say, where are you now? Yeah. What's that code for, by the way?
I don't know who you are.
What's that?
I don't know who you are.
Oh, no, it's code for more than that.
Really?
Is it
Yeah.
worth my time to talk to you?
Yes. Are you going to help me get my next job or not? Welcome to the warm, friendly, fuzzy community of Washington. Yeah, I once was unemployed and told someone when they asked that, I said, oh, well, right now I'm a ward of the state. And you would think my genitalia was falling off and it was contagious. They repelled within 10 seconds. I was alone in the room. It's a great way to get, solitude in a crowded party. Just say, I'm a ward of the state. But no, I suppose we all have to explain where we are now. I think the simple thing is common sense. Fewer is better, and fewer hands is better, but you want to know what the other fellow's up to, and if you don't, be careful. Duh. What's interesting is the literature doesn't draw that conclusion. What does this tell you? We're in trouble if we're just reading. We're in more trouble if we don't reflect on what we do read. I recommend the latter, by the way. Read and reflect. Now, I was going to walk you through some other slides. Chris, I've shown you this, right? Everyone's seen this, right? Yeah, well, is that our future? The only thing else I wanted to show you are sort of amplifications of the arms control talk, which I gave yesterday. And I suppose we don't have to go through this. We went through that. We don't have to go through the missiles. We get that. The rendezvous status, we got better graphics for than the last lecture. I didn't realize it, but all God's children are working on these things. And I think the worry I have here is that if you can threaten to quickly put out of commission someone's key MILSAT, do I even show? I don't show the MILSATs. The MILSATs, there are a lot of them. They're communication satellites, infrared satellites, satellites that are designed to survey and get imagery and various bandwidth. These things, not to mention GPS and all the things we use commercially, they're subject to possibly being taken out with these things, which these things are actually have useful, positive commercial purposes. And so you're not going to know. And they're going to be potentially very close to you, and you're not going to get warning to be able to do anything about this. Figuring out how to cope with this is probably leveraged with regard to nuclear deterrence and conventional military capability and the prosperity of your economy as 1,000 is to 1 compared to just worrying about things that blow up. do we have enough nuclear weapons? Are they modern enough? Are the delivery systems good? That may not amount to anything if your nervous system and eyes and ears are knocked out. This thing cries out for attention now. Guess how we're dealing with it? Well, if you don't talk about it, you should be fine. Not sure that's a complete thought. Anyway, I talked about that yesterday. The only other thing that I did not talk about in this class, which means that I'm certainly not legitimate as anyone who knows anything about national security, is the word cyber. If you wanted to, I think you could have a free meal at least once every other day going to conferences on this. I don't have much to say about it other than to observe that the idea that the government is going to be able to protect us against how this capability might be used against us doesn't sound right. And the reason why is the people that are in cutting edge work in AI and cyber don't like working with the government, number one. And number two, my own experience in the Pentagon suggests that if you get the brightest nodes in that building working on AI, you end up with systems that don't work a lot of the time. I mean, my own experience is they ended up buying Macs and PCs in the same office system to see how things would work together, and they didn't. I think it was a buy of about 2,000 machines. I mean, so maybe things have gotten better and they're just much sharper people. We have a problem there. In other words, integrating with the commercial leading edge folk and getting them to feel comfortable to work in government for a short time, not for 40 years, not for 20, to get a clearance, but not in 18 months, but in maybe 3 weeks or something. It isn't, if you don't figure that out, this thing's going to roll right over you. And it might in ways that are hard to know. One of the things, a good friend of mine who's very respected and knowledgeable and advises the Pentagon on missile warfare said it could be that the cost to deliver high munitions with missiles, long ranges, is going to get prohibitively high to be the opening shot to break open defense corridors for planes. If that's so, he said, you'll have to do it some other way with cyber. Well, that has enormous implications if that's true, because that has been the main argument and event of American defense policy, that we could always use unmanned missile systems to do the dirty work. And that's been the dominant idea, I think, since at least the 80s. So we're talking about paradigm shift. If he's right, and I suspect he knows more than I do. I'm not going to dwell on the solutions unless you want me to in Q&A. I think you already probably have an inkling of what I think in this regard anyway. But I thought I'd leave at least the last half hour to you. So when I hand it over to you. Now, if you're silent, I am going to be so disappointed in you. I'm going to give you all very low grades. Yes.
So for the zebra crowd.
Did you say zebra or zero?
Zero.
Zero, okay.
What sort of international regime would have the teeth to inspect and verify and enforce that view of the world?
Well, I think you have to start with taking what you have, like the IEA, and as I mentioned yesterday, this NATO crew, which included a lot of Frenchmen, I gotta point out, which is fun. And the reason why is they like to export nuclear things. I said, you need to actually get the IEA to distinguish between what it can monitor and what it can safeguard. I think if we did that, and more important, if we start talking that way as a government, and we got our allies to talk that way, it'd make a big difference. Because then you'd say, well, if it's an enrichment reprocessing plant or a fuel fabrication plant, even though it's claimed to be civil and peaceful, you can't know if it's being diverted for military purposes and enough time to do anything about it, and therefore it is dangerous. And unless there's a super compelling economic reason, there are super military security reasons to say no. Do not do this. Do not go to square one. I think in addition, it's okay to have perhaps a secretariat at the UN to enforce the NPT, because the enforcement part of it really cries out for attention. We don't even do it. You know, I don't know whether you noticed, but this administration, much like the previous in all fairness, said it's very important that North Korea rejoin the NPT. Well, that sounds pretty harmless, doesn't it? And live up to its obligations under it.
Did they technically ever withdraw?
Oh, they technically did withdraw, but we technically agreed that they could, which technically is a bad idea. We should have said, well, you may be technically not in the treaty, but you are totally legally obligated to live up to your obligations under it because you violated the treaty before you left. I don't know, is there anybody here that's ever met a lawyer or been one? Okie dokie. Would you advise a client, if they wanted to get out of their contractual responsibilities, to violate the contract and then leave? No. Why? Well, because normal practice is you're held accountable for upholding the terms of your contract, whether you leave it or not. This is common sense. It may be Western common sense, but hey, that's the way the law is cast. We don't talk that way about North Korea. Secretariat might be able to discipline people to understand that. I think in addition, it would be useful to take existing things like the NPT and say, you know, if you are not compliant with this, the cost might be that some international authority that you have or protection you have no longer exists till you come back into compliance. My favorite, although it may be harebrained, is maybe you don't have the right to launch nuclear-capable missiles out of your country if you're not in compliance with the NPT and you were a member when you violated it. That would be North Korea. Well, why would you want that? Well, maybe we have to hit things before they go very far. You have to invade their airspace. How are you going to do that legally? Well, you're going to have to start asserting what it means to be compliant with the NPT. I would encourage people to start thinking that the NPT is not something that only people who hate the U.S. government think we ought to be complying with. It is not just a disarmament rhetorical twist. I mean, it's been turned into that. I don't think you want it to be turned just into that. We've let that happen. That is a mistake.
So how do you walk that back since we already went down that path?
You know, one of the things the man who got me into this field the most used to say, this is Albert Wohlstetter, it would be nice if we could just stop making our mistakes hereditary. Just because we've done something dumb doesn't mean we have to, you know, grandfather it forever. You can say, that was a mistake. I mean, say what you will about Mr. Trump. He has argued that we took the wrong course on various things and said, we're going the opposite direction. And you know what? It's because of that that he has a base. So it's not politically disastrous to do what I just described. It's just we're not inclined to do it. Maybe we need to on the things that matter. I don't encourage you to just turn up every rock. I once told an employee of mine who used to criticize everyone equally, no matter what, on something they got wrong. I said, you know, you don't get extra points for being right. You have to be persuasive. So if you're going to pick a fight over something that matters. I think this matters. So, you know, there's a radical thought. Do your job. Like I said, that'll get you in trouble in this town, but sorry, that's It's in the description to do it. So I would do it. Silence? Really? Oh, this man has got a lot of questions. Go ahead.
So,
By the way, I did not completely answer your question. I was just trying to show that there are answers. In other words, I think it's fair enough to say that the crowd that's been pushing international law the last, I'd say, 40 years has been trying to show that the United States shouldn't be able to do anything. There used to be a view of international law. If you go down to NDU, National Defense University, there's a bust of Mr. Root, who was Secretary of War and then created the International Court of Law, and then International Law, I think, Society. And someone once, he later became Secretary of State. Someone asked him, well, you're just so hard-headed, because he was very rough. I mean, I think overly so, with regard to the Philippines and a lot of things like that. Why are you such a mamby-pamby about international law? And of course, they didn't say it that way. Why are you concerned about international law? And he said, well, if you can convince people to do something that's in your interest, it's a lot less expensive or bloody. Why wouldn't you do it? I think hard-headed people need to come back to trying to compete for the minds of people about what rules should apply to everybody. You want to be in that game, trying to push something that's in your interest as well as in the interest of others. And, you know, we need to get hard-headed about this stuff. All right? But just joining up and having proposals, no, I'm not for that. I think we can do better than that. All right? But you had a question.
and so you did mention cyber. My concern there is that all of these weapons are controlled more and more through electronic means of some sort, and there's certainly potential for problems there.
Yes.
But there's other things that are kind of on the horizon in terms of new classes of weapons and threats, such as drones and hypersonic weapons. And
Well, we
artificial
did
intelligence and biotech.
discuss the hypersonics and drones. I mean, that certainly got attention. Now you're going to, was it you said artificial intelligence?
Right, but also global warming is a bit of a threat. How do those kinds of things color what we've talked about in class?
It's unclear. You know, as I mentioned to you before, being married to an Australian makes me very skeptical about doing policy prescriptions with regard to global warming. They burn a lot of coal, and they used to be very defensive. Now they've flipped. Now you're not even supposed to eat certain foods because it, you know, adds to the methane. So, you know, they've got a lot of spare time down there. But I think the way to look at threats is not to press all of the buttons, but to think about a triage that works as follows. What are the things that it would take very little effort to put off a threat? Generally, you should do those first. I think when people are saying, well, you got to get rid of capitalism and market signals, or, you know, we've got to tax ourselves silly, I would be more careful. I would be more hesitant. I wouldn't say no, but, you know, that would not be on the top of my list of things to do. You know, no matter what your view is about it, you're going to the well of public opinion. You know, what's at stake here isn't the planet, it's self-government. Let's get clear. You want to do public policy in a way that sustains popular support for self-rule. Never, never lose sight of that. I would even go so far as that some threats to us I would be more than willing to ignore if they jeopardized our ability to maintain the experiment. Terrorism is a great example. There's a point at which you got to just say, you know, that's fine, it may happen, and we're just not going to go to the mat. Because going to the mat means turning off the lights on a lot of certain fundamental propositions to self-government, and we're just not going to go there. So you have to figure out the triage, and I'm trying to suggest some metrics for that. that I think makes sense. Generally, whenever I do policy stuff, I go, here's something which if we didn't do, we would make more money. And I always say, now, if we're not willing to embrace something where we not only save money, but we make more money, there's something wrong with us. The bar of getting people to move on things is very low. The way things normally work is you have to wait till something has shocked us into action. A bone saw, a test explosion, someone caught lying to Congress about something.
Does that work in the long term, though? I mean, the examples you just gave, those are shocked into action, but those might be either too late or short term. So, I mean, it seems like if our 2 data points didn't shock us into something.
Well, how shall I put it? It's the reason we have a press.
Oh, okay.
It's your
No,
fault.
it's
It's
okay.
your fault.
And I'm here for that. I'm here for that. So, No,
Public
this is the
public
process.
opinion matters. I'm just telling you that thumos, which is sort of emotional moral indignation, is prerequisite to listening to logos. You better have your studies ready for that moment. If you do, so far so good. If you don't, it will get even worse. As bad as it is, as you see it, it could get much, much worse if you don't do the thinking and reflection now and try to get people to do the minimal things which aren't expensive. And when there's a shock, you can step up your game because you have brief B as well. And yeah, you need a press so that we find out just exactly what a bone saw is and why would anyone need one.
Well, how else are you going to tear a journalist apart with that one? I mean, that's obvious, but I mean,
Well, there you
no
go.
matter what you report, and I mean, forget about like any small outlet. You could argue that the Washington Post, for whom I do not work, has done a hell of a job reporting everything in their outrage and indignation on their opinion pages where Mr. Khashoggi worked for, has been really loud, but then you have Bolton saying, well, no, I didn't listen to the
How shall I put it? We'll take a poll here. Does anybody think that our relations with Saudi Arabia are likely to change at all as a result of the news about the killing? Okay, so raise your hand if you think the answer is no.
That it won't change?
That it won't change at all. Okay. And how many think it will change somewhat?
Somewhat.
I'm with the, as Lincoln would say, the 2 people against the 20 win. I think you're already seeing it. If somebody who's been absolutely tied into the nuclear reactor sale, I can tell you it's on ice.
I actually just got a news alert that came across that Putin high-fived the Saudi prince. And I'm sure that wasn't a dig at the U.S. at all. I'm sure.
Yeah, well, but what's that got to do with us?
Well,
They've been
I mean,
to the
other people sell reactors.
Well, wait a minute. Excuse me. I didn't say, by the way, if they want to buy Russian reactors, make my day. I think they're out of their minds. They'll have spies all over that country feeding stuff to the Iranians before you can say implosion. So, I'm not so sure that's a complete thought. Also, what's that got to do with us selling them? Nothing.
Oh, I think it does.
Yeah. Well, but what do we have to sell?
Well, what do we have to sell? Westinghouse, right?
That's not. It's a Canadian firm.
Hear me out.
Yeah.
So, but they have U.S. parts, do they not? That's
No.
what we have to sign.
No,
up
it's
for
just
here.
design. It's just design work.
Ah,
Actually, if you go to NEI, they're more candid and informed. They say it's not Westinghouse; it's a Korean firm.
and they have U.S. parts and technology, right?
Well,
South Korean firm.
they may. Bottom line, that's a work in progress. And if you think that nothing is going to change, you know more than I do. I mean, last I checked, they had a vote and we'll see what happens.
Well,
But
nothing's gonna happen until next year at least anyway, maybe, right?
okay.
Maybe,
Well, how should I-
maybe, but
okay.
like tens
Ma'am,
of thousands of.
I'm trying to be on your side on this, and
Yeah.
you're fighting me every way.
We're
What
good
I,
at that.
what I'm trying to do is explain to you why you wake up in the morning and report to work. It's because you do not believe that it doesn't matter. You believe it does, and that's the reason you write stories. The rest of you, I would strongly recommend a reexamination of self-government and public service if you think nothing will ever change. You've got to believe that at some level, maybe not in this case, but at least some other case that you're interested in, there will be a moment when people will listen to argument and something smarter will be done compared to something dumber. If you do not believe that, please go away. Sorry. Now, I could be wrong, but you know what? I'm not interested in learning how wrong I am. I'm too old. Other questions? No, there's got to be someone else. Yes.
Sir, do you have any thoughts on the apparent mismatch between the nuclear posture review and what the DoD thinks that we should be doing with our nuclear forces and the incoming Congress? And what they've
It's
said?
going to be interesting. That came up more than once yesterday at the NATO gathering. Well, first of all, they're going to have to make, the administration will have to make the case for modernization. And there is a case. I mean, it's that 62 Falcon I was talking about. I mean, some of this stuff is really old. But they're going to get their head handed to them on a couple of fronts. I just don't know which one. There's going to be give and take. I don't think they're going to walk the whole thing back. And the reason why is some of the stuff is just really old. I mean, you would not want it to stay that way. I think the bigger question that deserves more attention is how survivable are these new forces going to be, particularly the land-based stuff? I wonder. And there's not a very good narrative on that. I think it's something like, well, they'd have to, use so many nuclear warheads to knock them out, they wouldn't ever do it. That is not a complete thought. You want to be able to say, well, they wouldn't be able to knock them out. Not that, oh, well, they'd have to use so many, they wouldn't do it. By the way, there's some truth to that. It's just not a very, rhetorically, not a very satisfying argument, is it? The other thing is all this stuff about space and cyber. The command, control, communication, surveillance, and intelligence dimensions are so leveraged compared to what we're talking about. Did I tell you about the arms and legs argument? I met somebody, I'll protect him, who moved from Homeland Security to the State Department. And I said, so what's the difference? He said, well, over at Homeland Security, everything was arms and legs. And then he paused, he said, no brain now. We got a lot done. Then I said, so what's it like over here at State? He said, entirely brain, no arms, no legs, we can't do anything. I think with your nuclear forces, you do not want to be either Homeland Security or the State Department. You gotta have something in between. For my money, I want to hear the narrative on that, and that they've classified it too much that you can't talk about it is a mistake. Because it may cost a lot of money to straighten that out. And I just don't know how well we're doing. I'm hoping that the representatives in Congress are, like Mr. Cooper and Mr. Rogers, are not alone, that there are a lot of them looking at this. That part of modernization, you better hope we're doing. I don't care, and anybody who argues against that is arguing against basically not just nuclear deterrence, but conventional deterrence and having a healthy economy that can be protected. I mean, it's that important. Now, the problem there is a lot of the stuff in the next 15 to 20 years is going to be commercial that we're going to be relying on. It will not be military. So it gets complicated quickly, but that thing definitely needs attention. As to, how things sort out, I think some things will get modernized, but not everything on the list, apparently. So what does it say? Elections have consequences, so, let's see what happens. But they're going to have to make the case much more than they had to before. That's okay. Yeah.
So how does that tie into, on the same lines, there's an op-ed post today regarding the low-yield nuclear weapons and the fact that we need to bolster that part of the arsenal.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And some of the argument was, I mean, it's kind of an older argument, but it's based on the fact that the Russians and Russian philosophy, and that they have a lot of low yield or tactical.
I wouldn't go about it that way.
I understand, but that was kind of the argument.
Well, you
that was
asked
thrown
what
out
I
there.
think. Let me explain what I think. Seems to me the idea that going to lower yields is a bad idea strikes me as a bad idea. I mean, what part of yes do you not like? If all the weapons we had were a lot lower yield, well, there would be a lot less destruction. Then people say, oh, it'll be increased probability of use. Really? I don't know. That one seems as much of a stretch as anything else. The argument for doing that, though, is not present. The argument would be we ought to make clear, even more so than we have, and go to every country that has nuclear weapons to get them to agree, that we ought to be reducing the level of destructiveness of our arsenal, and we should not be targeting innocents. In that regard, going to lower yields has a perfectly decent argument, one that people ought to be more readily willing to embrace. But if you don't have that other part of the policy publicly laid out and you're really working it, it looks like you want to start World War III with these things. Well, maybe they need to change their argument, because you know what? I would be apprehensive if I didn't hear the other argument that I laid out. But there's no reason why we can't make the other argument, is there? Is there? Maybe we should get on with it. Might make that easier to justify. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, it gets away from what you always hear.
Why we're here.
Exactly.
So with that, you said less is better, but if you continue to go less, at some point with the law of armed conflict, the minimum deterrence, you gotta go towards a counter value type strategy.
Yes.
How do you keep it credible?
Well, no, wait a minute. I'm not sure you have to go there. I'm not sure the numbers does it. It's what are we aiming at with these things is the question. What is the military target set that dictates the use of large explosives? You need a story there. It's buried. It's hard. It's diffuse, but it's not near a city. Would you please talk to me about that? Once you get that story out, the numbers follow. But if you don't have that story out there, and you just say, well, if you go down super low, then the only thing that you really would be inclined to hit is cities, strikes me as a real jumping, as they say, of the shark. In other words, and why would you want to do that? Oh, because that's all you can do? No, wait a minute. Well, why would you ever want to do it even if that's all you can do? The answer ought to be, well, you don't want to do that ever. It doesn't help.
Toward targeting populations is if you have very few weapons, but they're possibly high yield, not necessarily.
Yeah, but
low yield.
let me ask you the question. There are a lot of things you could do with a pistol that are really dramatic, but I'm not guessing, A, you have one, or B, you're going to do it. That is not a complete thought, okay?
The problem is in all of these cases, we don't really know what the real targeting is.
Well, I think perhaps there's some
And
need.
how do we so in the Department of Defense, how do we communicate that yet continue to abide by the security barriers that are there for a reason? You don't want to provide your adversary exactly what you're doing and when you're
Okay,
going to do it.
how shall I put it? You've just raised the challenge to self-government. And all I can say is, you want to do as well as you can, and we're not there yet. Okay? But I think, I worked in the executive. I was a 2-star general equivalent. Big deal. But what I learned was, the genius of the executive is, don't tell them anything. It'll pass. And I'm telling you, that's not smart. I mean, I remember a phone call with a super senior official telling me I didn't have to testify. I said, well, they're asking if we're following the law. They pay the bills. I worked over there. I'm kind of inclined to kind of follow the pledge that I made, uphold the law and the Constitution. You don't mind if I do that, do you? It's unbelievable. So my return to you is, yeah, plenty of room left, though. You better come up with a narrative that works and tries to square that circle a little bit better than we're doing. Because otherwise it's just like this big black box. Also, a friend of mine who's a lot older than I am pointed out that actually the government of the United States changed with nuclear weapons. We gave much, much more authority and power to the president. I mean, when you think about it, it's quite wild. The entire question of war and not war went largely wanting for debate as a result of the creation of nuclear weapons. So, instead of not knowing that or not thinking about that or talking about it, maybe we should. Does that help? Okay. Damn it, we're over. 5 minutes over. Now, there is a retreat, and all of you are deputized and authorized to participate. That's in February?
February 23rd.
Okay, I'm not entirely clear what we're going to have in our show and tell, but amongst the topics, you don't have anything printed out, either of you. I can remember them.
Printed out.
What's that?
I don't have them printed out.
So the answer is no. We're going on my memory. This could be risky. What we'll have at a minimum is some discussion of a project that my center has launched, and there should be papers by then, of how might Russian military thinking, including on nuclear weapons and their use, be influencing the thinking of India, Pakistan, China? And how would we know or measure it? What are the overlapping common strategic objectives of these countries, and where do they diverge? So that there are a battery of papers on that. I think by then, I'm hoping we'll have some paper to discuss what war in space might look like, and what an act of war in space might be if you could make it what you wanted it to be. Or short of that, what are the red lines in space conflict that we ought to be talking about publicly, saying if these are crossed, the following general things are going to be in store for you. We don't talk about that, and we need to get started real soon. What were the other topics?
Life after INF.
Missiles. We may have a presentation, if I'm lucky, on what is the future of missile warfare, including to what extent might cyber obviate the advantages in 5 to 20 years of relying so heavily on them in the opening moments of conflict. Well, that gives you a flavor. We'll give you the agenda as it becomes clearer who it is that's actually going to finish their work on time to give you a presentation. It would generally fall on a Saturday, and we might have a dinner before, I don't know. Usually something from like 9:30 to 3 or something. It's a bit much, but it's pretty informal, so it's worth the aggravation. On that note, I've really enjoyed having you, and I'd like to think maybe this was more fun than you thought it would be. I don't know. Okay. I enjoyed it. Thank you.